Hello YouTube and welcome to my channel. We're going to continue our summary and analysis of the Republic with Book 2. If you haven't watched my review and summary of Book 1, you can find it in the description. It will be helpful to watch that to get the context for this video. Anyway, we left off last time with Socrates having found the three definitions of justice presented to him inadequate, and still desiring to know the true nature of justice. He also showed that justice, whatever it is, must be better than injustice. That is, it is better for oneself to live justly than to live unjustly, and it is here that Book 2 begins. Glaucon, who had been Socrates' original companion, speaks up and says, "Socrates, do you want to actually persuade us or only to appear to have done so?" Socrates, of course, says that he wishes to actually persuade them. Glaucon then argues that there are three different kinds of goods. There are some things that are pleasurable in themselves and not for any benefit they provide. Glaucon gives the example of simple harmless pleasures. There are also some goods that are desirable in themselves and also for beneficial consequences of them. And finally, there are things that might not be desirable in themselves, but still human beings pursue them because they provide good consequences, exercising being the obvious example here. He asks Socrates in which category he would put justice, and Socrates says that justice would be in the best category, those things that are good in themselves and also provide good consequences. Now Glaucon points out that many people instead argue that a just person may be good because it gives you a good reputation, but not for its own sake. And he says that Thrasymachus was, like a snake, too quickly charmed by Socrates, and Socrates hadn't in fact shown that justice is good for its own sake. Now, this is interesting for several reasons. Notice how Glaucon calls Thrasymachus a snake. This is not the first time animal analogies have been used. Thrasymachus had been called a wild beast in Book 1. Obviously, these are unflattering comparisons, but comparing human beings to animals will become much more relevant later in the dialogue. Also, what's interesting is that Glaucon seems to suggest that Socrates had done the group a disservice, that Socrates had failed to win the argument against Thrasymachus. But the debate before wasn't whether justice is intrinsically good. It was, is justice better than injustice? Socrates seemed to answer that question satisfactorily. Now Glaucon is moving the goalposts to keep the conversation going. This is a theme that will also come up again in the dialogue. Glaucon goes on to say he intends to do three things. First, express the popular opinion of justice. Second, point out that those who practice justice do so as a necessity but not as a good thing in itself. And finally, show that the life of the unjust man is better than the life of the good man. Interestingly, Glaucon is quite eager to point out that this is not his own opinion. He wants Socrates to explain the argument for why justice is good in itself because he wants to believe it, but he finds the opposite argument more convincing right now. Glaucon is essentially saying he's playing devil's advocate. Let's see how good an advocate he is. Glaucon begins by arguing that doing injustice is naturally good, that people enjoy committing injustices, whereas having injustice committed against oneself is bad, and the displeasure of having injustice committed to oneself is far exceeding the enjoyment of committing injustice against another. Because no one wants to suffer injustice, the people enter into agreements and set laws with one another that they will not commit injustice against each other. Glaucon agrees that this is the compromise between what would be the best solution, committing injustice without having injustice committed against oneself, and the worst, being forced to suffer injustice without the ability to retaliate. It is the mean between two extremes. Therefore, if there was a man who could get away with being unjust and face no fear of retaliation from it, he ought to be unjust towards others. There are three different things that stand out about this statement from Glaucon. First, note the apparent similarity between Glaucon's theory of laws and the social contract theory developed by Hobbes in Leviathan. Though important differences do exist, the central claim bears a certain similarity. Out of fear of death or injury at the hand of another against whom one cannot extract revenge, men enter into a contract through which they hope to prevent wrongdoing being done to themselves. That's from Hobbes' Leviathan. Note that 2,000 years separate these two works, so it shows great continuity of the Western tradition. On the other hand, while in Leviathan it is presented as the protagonistic theory, in the Republic it is presented as one of the theories of justice that Socrates needs to respond to. Also, Note how Glaucon says that justice is a mean between the worst case and the best case. The identification of the virtue as a mean sounds similar to the claim Aristotle will make that virtue is a mean between two extremes. Finally, what is strange about this definition is that it defines justice in contrast to injustice. In other words, Glaucon says that justice is an agreement between parties not to be unjust towards one another. But how could such an agreement take place without first defining what injustices are? And wouldn't that require a prior definition of justice? Glaucon goes on to give us a hypothetical example. Suppose a man were to find a ring that would turn him invisible, so that he could commit injustices and not be caught. Glaucon argues that no man would willingly choose to avoid injustice, since what makes people just is fear of punishment. As an aside, readers might notice the similarity between the One Ring in The Lord of the Rings and this ring. While Tolkien, having been educated at Oxford, would have certainly known the myth Glaucon refers to here, we don't actually have evidence that he based his One Ring on the ring of this myth. But it's not a long stretch to suppose that he knew of this myth and therefore might have included it as one of his inspirations. But with this hypothetical, Glaucon challenges Socrates with the following. To truly know whether it is better to be just or unjust, we must imagine an unjust man, capable of the worst injustices, like someone with this ring, but who is perceived to be just. Similarly, we must imagine a just man who is perceived by everyone to be unjust. Can Plato say that the life of the just man is better even when the unjust is honored as a just man, while the just man is reviled as an unjust man? Because the unjust man is perceived as just. He will be given power, respect, and wealth that comes with it, whereas the just man will be mocked, beaten, and even killed for his injustice. Glaucon also makes a remarkable statement. Those who live by justice only do so because they live by the opinion of their fellow man, because they don't really desire to be just but only to appear so, whereas the unjust man pursues a thing dependent on truth of the matter, because they don't wish to appear but really be unjust. I'm interpreting a little here, but what Glaucon seems to be arguing is that a man who acts according to his desires, even if they are unjust, is to be praised for not acting in accord with opinion. What's crazy about this statement is that in a somewhat crude form, it bears similarity to arguments made by postmodernists like Nietzsche and Jean-Paul Sartre, who argued that authenticity to self ought to be praised above the opinions of others. Now, this is a passing comment from Glaucon that I might be reading into a lot more than what was intended, but Glaucon's argument here that injustice is pursuing a thing dependent on truth, whereas justice is only pursued in the light of opinion, is such a radical reversal of the medieval and even modern Western tradition that it's hard to imagine it preceded it. Before Socrates could respond to Glaucon, Glaucon's brother Adeimantus is going to raise the stakes even more. He quotes a number of ancient writers to support the point he is going to make. For brevity, I won't reproduce his quotes, but they all deal with justice and injustice being rewarded or punished by the gods. Remember, Greece at that time was a pagan polytheist nation with a large pantheon of gods. Adeimantus argues that to fully examine whether it is better to be unjust or just, we must also imagine that the unjust man is protected from punishment by the gods. Either there are no gods, or the gods can be bribed with votive offerings paid for by thefts committed by the unjust man. Glaucon and Adeimantus' speech express an important theme that will become central later on in the Republic in different ways: the differences between seeming and appearing and actually being. They also reveal a little bit about Socrates' reputation. Adeimantus, in fact, says, "Look, Socrates, from anyone else, I could accept a defense of justice based on the fact that by being a just man, you'll be honored as a just man and be rewarded for it. But you have spent your entire life arguing that justice is good in itself and not just for the extrinsic rewards attached to it." Thus, Adeimantus draws a distinction between the orators and poets and other philosophers of ancient Greece and Socrates. In another one of Plato's dialogues, The Trial of Socrates, Socrates is actually put on trial for his controversial opinions. So it's interesting to see that distinction drawn here already. And that dialogue, The Trials of Socrates, will be something that will come back in this video. Socrates responds to Adeimantus and Glaucon in praise for still believing that justice is better than injustice despite being able to speak so much in favor for injustice, and saying that he isn't sure he'll be able to defend justice from such a strong argument. After being begged to try, he decides to do so. He begins by saying that this argument will require someone who can see sharply, and since they are not clever men, they need to improvise. He notes that if a man has trouble reading very small text, it would be helpful to read a version of the text with large letters first, assuming the two texts are otherwise the same. Adeimantus agrees, but asks what that has to do with the discussion of justice. Socrates says that people speak of justice in regards to a single man, but they also speak of justice in regards to an entire city, and a city is obviously bigger than a single man. So Socrates recommends they examine what justice looks like in a city, and then try to apply that to the consideration of justice in an individual. He suggests that they build a city with speech. In other words, they're going to try to imagine a hypothetical city from its founding and examine where justice and injustice develop in the city. So they embark on this task. And this is the entire crux of the Republic, the central conceit on which the whole thing is built. That justice in a city is going to look like the justice in a single man. So Socrates begins by saying, a city comes into being because each of us is not self-sufficient, but in need of much. So then when one man hires another for one need and another for another need, and since many things are needed, many men gather in one settlement as partners and helpers. To this common settlement we give the name city, don't we? Now notice what Socrates has slipped in. Glaucon began by asserting that the origins of justice are found in man's fear of being wronged by each other. Therefore, men agree to laws not to wrong each other. Socrates has changed the origin of justice by beginning his founding of the city on men needing each other for needs each cannot fulfill for himself. Society isn't just a compromise between antagonistic individuals, but a natural result of a man's need for another man. Socrates and Adeimantus go on to discuss the needs of their small city: food, housing, clothing, shoes, and the affairs of the body, presumably medicine. They go on to point out that it is much more efficient if people were to specialize labor, so that one man is a farmer, one is a builder of houses, one a weaver of clothes, so on and so forth. Thus, the smallest possible city requires 4 or 5 people. This develops a principle that will be referred to throughout the book, the principle that in this just city, each person will only do one job, so that they will be specialized in it. Now, because of this principle that each person only do one job, Socrates points out that the farmer or the builder should not make their own tools, and so the city is in need of people to make tools. So to the city are added carpenters, smiths, cowherds, shepherds, and herdsmen. Now, Socrates notes it's hard to find a place with all the resources the city needs, so there will have to be merchants who can go outside the city and trade for resources the city needs. Furthermore, because trade is a necessity, the city must produce enough not just for itself, but also to trade with other cities. So there will need to be more farmers and craftsmen. And if our city's commerce is to be conducted by sea, we will also need sailors. Furthermore, for the city's marketplace to function, we will need tradesmen internally to the city, as well as an established currency so that people don't have to spend all day in the marketplace to sell their goods, but can sell them to the tradesmen who will in turn sell them to the people who need it. Finally, Socrates says, there will naturally be people whose minds are not up to the level of partnership, but whose bodies are strong enough for labor. So the city will also have plenty of so-called wage earners. Having so filled out the city, Socrates asks if the city is complete and if the group has spotted justice and injustice yet. Adeimantus says no. So Socrates suggests considering the kind of lives the citizens of this city would live, and the description is long but worth reading in full. Won't they make bread, wine, clothing, and shoes? And when they have built houses, they will work in the summer, for the most part naked and without shoes, and in the winter they will be adequately clothed and shod. For food they will prepare barley meal and wheat flour, they will cook it and knead it, setting out noble loaves of barley and wheat on some reeds or clean leaves. They will stretch out on rushes strewn with yew and myrtle and feast themselves and their children. Afterwards they will drink wine and crowned with wreaths sing of the gods. So they will have sweet intercourse with one another and not produce children beyond their means, keeping an eye out against poverty or war. Glaucon responds, "You seem to make these men have their feast without relishes," suggesting that the life Socrates is describing seems somewhat devoid of everything except work, eating, and sex. He in fact calls it a city of pigs. Note the use of animal metaphors again. Socrates responds saying, then we must not only consider how a city comes into being, but how a luxurious one comes into being. He says that the city he just described seems to him a true city, a healthy city, but if they want, they can instead consider what he calls a feverish city. They add painters, hunters, poets, musicians, dancers, actors, more craftsmen, cooks, wet nurses, barbers, and most interestingly, swineherds. That one is particularly interesting because remember, Glaucon had called the healthy city of necessity a city of pigs, but Socrates emphasizes how pigs and swineherds will be necessary in Glaucon's feverish city. It's a minor point perhaps, but a little fun bit of humor. Oh, you're calling my city a city of pigs? Well, your city has actual pigs in it. He also notes that there will be a need for more doctors, because presumably the lifestyles of these people, and especially their diets, will be more unhealthy than those in the modest city. Now here it gets interesting. Socrates then notes that while the land the city was on might have been enough to support the modest city, now it is insufficient to feed and house the much larger population of the feverish city. So they will need to take land from their neighbors. And Socrates concludes that they found the origin of war in those things whose presence in cities most of all produces evils both private and public. This is an incredibly revealing statement. Socrates is claiming two things. Luxury is the origin of war, and luxury is the largest cause of evil, both public and private. What's amazing is that in a discussion presumably about justice, upon which the claim that luxury is the source of evil would have clear implications, Glaucon just accepts it and doesn't ask Socrates to elaborate. I'll return to this point at the end of this video, but this interchange right here I think is a necessary key to unpacking the meaning of the Republic. Socrates claims that the need for war will require the city to grow again because the city will now need an entire army. Glaucon asks whether the current citizens couldn't also go to war for the city, but Socrates reminds him that that's impossible because of what they agreed to previously, that each citizen should only do one job. And if soldiering is its own job, then it seems that we will need a professional army. Quote, "After all, we prevented the shoemaker from trying at the same time to be a farmer, or a weaver, or a house builder. He had to stay a shoemaker just so the shoemaker's art would produce fine work for us. And in the same way, to each one of the others we assigned one thing, the one for which his nature fitted him, at which he was to work throughout his life, exempt from other tasks, not letting the crucial moments pass, and thus doing a fine job. Isn't it of the greatest importance that what has to do with war be done well? Or is it so easy that a farmer or a shoemaker or a man practicing any other art whatsoever can be at the same time skilled in the art of war?" Glaucon agrees, and agrees again with Socrates when he says that a good soldier for the city will need a nature fit to be a guardian. So Socrates asks a strange-sounding question. Do you suppose that for guarding there is any difference between the nature of a noble puppy and that of a well-born young man? He says. Both need sharp senses, speed to catch what they perceive, and finally strength to fight what they catch. They also both have courage and a thing called spiritedness. Now, the word for spiritedness in Greek is thumos, and the exact meaning of that word is unclear, but it has been translated as spiritedness or passion. I had a professor who took a somewhat unique position that thumos might have meant adrenaline. Obviously not the chemical itself, but the adrenaline rush. And although it's a unique perspective, I think it matches well to the way the word is used. Anyway, Glaucon agrees that a young man and a puppy both need all the qualities listed, but asks Socrates why he asked that question. Socrates responds that the guardian of the city is going to have to be a special kind of person. He must be fierce towards the enemies of the city, but gentle towards its citizens. These kind of natures appear to be in contradiction with each other, and yet we do see it in dogs. Dogs are gentle to people they know, but fierce against strangers. And here Socrates makes a giant leap. Dogs are philosophical animals because they distinguish what belongs to it according to what it knows and what it is ignorant of, and therefore it must be a lover of learning, which means it's a lover of wisdom. So let's recap what Socrates just did here. He says, dogs are friendly towards people they know and fierce towards people they don't. To be friendly towards what you know and hostile to what you don't know makes you a lover of learning. To be a lover of learning is to be a lover of wisdom. To be a lover of wisdom is to have a philosophic spirit. Therefore, dogs have philosophic spirits. Therefore, our guardians, which, like dogs, must be friendly towards people they know and fierce towards people they don't, must be philosophical. Let's ignore any possible problems we might have with the rest of the argument. For the sake of the argument, let's accept those. What is going on with premise 2? To be friendly towards what you know and hostile to what you don't makes you a lover of learning? Doesn't it seem like the opposite would be true? Presumably, to learn means to acquire knowledge of what you don't know. But can you desire to acquire what you don't have and be hostile to it at the same time? I mean, this makes sense in the context of an invading army. You want to acquire the enemy's territory while you're being hostile to the enemy. But it doesn't really make sense in the context of learning. I mean, I hated doing homework as much as the next kid, but I don't remember hostility towards the concept of geometry. I don't know about you guys, but this was always a part of the Republic that bothered me, because Glaucon just accepts this. He doesn't ask for further explanation, so we never really get it. So we don't know if Socrates means this completely unironically, or if there is some humor here that's missing. Now, you might say, look, the Republic is 10 books long, each book has like 3 distinct main arguments in them, they can't all be winners. Is it possible that Socrates is just, pardon the pun, dogging it on this one? Well, maybe. While researching this question, I came across the blog of Alan Gilbert, a professor at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies, and he has an article on this question titled Socrates' Worst Argument Ever. I'll put a link to his article in the description because it's too complex to summarize here, but he does give us a way of interpreting this argument, but for that we must read on. Allowing Socrates to be right, that young men are like noble puppies and dogs are philosophical animals, the natural question which Socrates brings up is, how are we to train young men to be philosophers? So Socrates argues that we must first train the youth in music and then gymnastics. Now, gymnastics means exercise of the body similar to what we mean. Music, however, has a more expansive meaning of any activity performed under the guidance of the muses, but especially lyric poetry sung to music. What makes Socrates' definition a little bit different is he focuses on the rational storytelling content of music by saying, you include speeches in music, don't you? He then points out that speeches have a double form, partly true, partly false. When asked to elaborate, he says, look, even before kids are old enough to exercise, we tell them stories which are mostly false but have some kernel of truth in them. So when kids are at their most impressionable, we tell them stories that are mostly false and opposite to what we want them to believe when they grow up. There's some truth to Socrates' complaint even today. We still tell kids fairy tales, stories about Santa Claus, with the expectation that as they grow older they'll retain what's good about those myths, but recognize that they are for the most part false. Socrates says we must supervise the makers of tales, and if they tell a fine tale it must be approved, but if it's not, it must be rejected. We'll persuade nurses and mothers to tell the approved tales. Most of the tales they tell now must be thrown out. When asked for examples of what tales must be thrown out, Socrates responds, the ones Hesiod and Homer told us. Now if this doesn't shock you, it should. Hesiod and Homer's myths were like the core of Greek literature at the time. I mean, what Socrates would be proposing would be like an English literature class throwing out the works of Shakespeare, or a Spanish lit class throwing out Don Quixote. But Socrates explains this by saying, look, the old myths are replete with stories of gods taking revenge on their fathers for wrongs done by killing them. Are these the stories we want to tell kids so that if they ever want to kill their father, they can claim they're only doing what the great gods did? Furthermore, the guardians of the city should not be told that the guards fight amongst each other. Now, Socrates does allow that perhaps some of these stories could be told to an inner circle which someone might join after a certain age and after making a big sacrifice, but they shouldn't form part of the curriculum for early youth training of the guardians. So, Zeus shouldn't be presented as a doer of both good and evil, but only as a doer of good. Not only this, but Socrates argues that stories of the gods changing into animals or different forms should also be rejected, because they suggest gods change, and the best things, Socrates argues, are the least likely to change or be altered by time. Bodies in the best condition are best able to withstand and remain unchanged by illness or injury. A plant in the best condition is least likely to be affected by weather conditions, and the best made clothes are going to be the ones that withstand change the longest. Now, there are certainly some counterexamples to this argument. There are some things that are better because they undergo change. Cement that doesn't change from liquid to solid would be pretty sucky cement. But Socrates does make a stronger argument, which is, if a god is the best, which Adeimantus grants, then it necessarily follows that he would be changing into a worse form. But why would a god willingly make himself worse? So stories of gods changing forms ought to be outlawed as well. Socrates also removes stories that describe the gods as lying. The reason is that people only lie because lies are useful. But a god would have no use for lies. They don't need to invent false histories to cover up ignorance of what happened in antiquity because they don't know what happened in antiquity. He wouldn't lie to protect a foolish friend because gods don't have foolish friends, and he obviously wouldn't lie out of fear for his enemies. So a god has no reason to lie. Thus, as Socrates says, we shouldn't say that they are wizards who transform themselves, nor do they mislead us by lies in speech or deed. Adeimantus agrees and the book ends there, abruptly. But why? Book 3 begins with a similar discussion about the education of the young guardians. Unlike the ending of Book 1 where the discussion had reached a natural pause before changing topic, the ending here seems arbitrary. Alan Gilbert, who I mentioned earlier, might be able to explain this. The ending seems abrupt if we take Socrates at his word here, but if Socrates is being ironic and doesn't mean the plain meaning of his words, then it's possible that he's made the point he wishes to make. The plain text of the words is that in order to train the youth of our perfect city to be good guardians of the city, we must be very strict about what they hear at a young age, and censure language that contradicts the morals we would like to instill in our youth. But is this really what Socrates, a man who was put to death for questioning authorities, disbelieving the gods, and corrupting the youth, meant? Allen, like many scholars, argues that the Republic must be understood in the context of another of Plato's works, the Apology of Socrates. The Apology details the speech of Socrates at his own trial, where he is on trial by the men of Athens for corrupting the youth, among other accusations. Allen argues that this section of the Republic is Plato pointing out what would happen if we actually tried to make a city that did not corrupt the youth. The Athenians censured Socrates, and Plato is, in the Republic, wryly pointing out that the same justification for doing that would lead to the censoring of the most important Greek stories of the time. The implication is that in order to prevent corrupting the youth, you must deprive the youth of all experience. This critique is incredibly relevant in our own times. On both the left and the right, there are different groups who argue for societal censorship on language and media for the sake of the benefit of citizens. We must ask, is denying citizens, especially the youth, cultural experiences and exposure to thought other than their own actually helpful for the development of the citizenry? This question will continue to be explored in Book 3 of the Republic. Until then, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, check out my other videos, and consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Links are in the description. Go with God.